This move, d4, immediately stakes a claim in the center of the board, aiming to control important central squares and open lines for the queen and bishop. By mirroring white's central pawn push with 1, d5, black immediately stakes a claim in the center, preparing to contest control of the crucial d4 and e4 squares and aiming for a symmetrical and solid pawn structure. This move initiates the queen's gambit, a foundational opening that immediately challenges black's central pawn and aims to gain space and influence in the center. This move establishes the queen's gambit declined, a solid and classical response that prepares to develop the kingside pieces and challenges white's central pawn majority. This move develops a knight towards the center, prepares castling, and maintains flexibility regarding the central pawn structure, common in the queen's gambit declined. This move, dxc4, transitions into the queen's gambit accepted, where black temporarily cedes central pawn control to gain an extra pawn, aiming to develop actively and equalize. This move, 4, e4, aggressively seizes central space and opens lines for development, challenging black's queen's gambit declined structure and aiming to capitalize on black's temporary pawn deficit. This move challenges white's central pawn on d4, aiming to disrupt the pawn center and potentially gain space or create an isolated pawn for white. This move boldly claims central space and opens a path for the queen's bishop, creating immediate tension and forcing black to decide how to resolve the central pawn conflict. This move resolves the central tension, opening lines for your pieces and creating a more dynamic pawn structure with potential for a central pawn majority. This move recaptures the pawn, opening the e-file and allowing white's pieces to develop actively, aiming for central control and potential kingside pressure. Developing the knight to f6 challenges white's central pawn on d5 and prepares to castle, aiming to resolve the tension in the center. White recaptures the pawn on c4, developing the bishop to an active square that controls the central diagonals and pressures black's queenside pawn structure. This developing move, 7, bd6, aims to castle the king and potentially prepare for an e5 pawn push later, while also challenging white's central control by directly confronting the bishop on c4. Castling kingside completes the development of the king and connects the rooks, securing a safe haven for the king while preparing for potential central pawn pushes or pawn breaks later in the game. This move completes the king's development and secures the monarch in the castle, a fundamental strategic principle that prepares for middle game play and defense. This move develops the bishop actively, aiming to pin the knight on f6 and disrupt black's harmonious development, potentially preparing to exploit the weakened light squares around black's king. This move develops the bishop and pins the knight, creating immediate pressure on white's central control and preparing to challenge the well-placed bishop on g5. Developing the knight to c3 reinforces the d5 pawn and prepares to castle kingside, continuing white's central expansion and harmonious piece development. Developing the knight to d7 supports the advanced c5 pawn and prepares to contest the center, a common theme in queen's gambit declined structures. This move is a standard prophylactic maneuver in many queen's gambit declined structures, preparing to reinforce the d5 pawn and potentially transfer the knight to a more active central square like f5 or g3. This move centralizes the queen, supporting the d5 pawn and preparing to potentially challenge white's central control by attacking the d5 pawn with na4. This move initiates a trade of bishops, simplifying the position and aiming to exploit the doubled pawns black will likely have after the recapture on f6. which could weaken their kingside pawn structure. This move, recapturing the bishop, resolves the tension on the f6 knight and prepares to challenge white's centralized pieces, aiming for a more dynamic pawn structure in the center. This move simplifies the position, trading a knight for a bishop, which generally favors black given the bishop pair's potential on the open diagonals after white's pawn advances. This pawn capture creates a doubled f-pawn, weakening the king's pawn structure but opening the g-file for attacking possibilities. This move is aimed at preventing black from activating their bishop on g4 by forcing a decision on the diagonal, while also reinforcing the kingside pawn structure. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to challenge white's control of the dark squares and potentially prepare for a kingside pawn advance. This move activates the rook, aiming to exert pressure on the e-file and prepare for potential central pawn advances or to support the knight's eventual repositioning. This move repositions the rook to the e-file, which is now open after the exchange of pawns and pieces, aiming to contest control and potentially pressure white's central pawns. This move repositions the queen to attack the weak pawn on b7, indirectly pressuring black's kingside pawn structure and creating tactical possibilities on the queenside. This move prepares to create counterplay on the queenside by potentially challenging white's control of the a6 f1 diagonal with the b5 pawn. This move initiates pawn expansion on the queenside, aiming to gain space and potentially create a passed pawn while also challenging black's pawn on a6. This move reroutes the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially preparing to challenge white's control of the central dark squares and support a future pawn push on the queenside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's kingside pawn structure and potentially support a future kingside attack. This move repositions the queen to a more active central square, preparing to support potential pawn advances and potentially coordinate with the rook on the e-file. This knight maneuver prepares to reposition the knight to a more active central square, likely f3, to support the central pawns and potentially attack black's kingside. This move redeploys the rook to a more active square, potentially preparing to challenge the open e-file or support central pawn advances. This move exchanges black's active bishop for white's knight, aiming to weaken black's kingside pawn structure and potentially exploit the resulting doubled f-pawns for strategic advantage. This move concedes the dark squared bishop pair and creates doubled, isolated pawns on the f-file, but it opens the f-file for the rook and attempts to gain activity. This knight maneuver reroutes to a more active square, aiming to control key central squares and potentially support a kingside attack while also defending against black's queenside pawn advances. The move =21. kg7 aims to improve the king's safety by moving it away from the open g-file and potential threats along the 7th rank, while also preparing to potentially support the g-pawn or defend the kingside. This move repositions the queen to a more active diagonal, preparing to potentially pressure black's queenside pawns or support an attack on the kingside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the weakened kingside and preparing to contest key central squares after white's next likely pawn push. This move sacrifices the bishop to create a passed pawn on the c-file, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain a dynamic advantage. Capturing the pawn on b2 is a material grab that weakens black's pawn structure and creates targets for white's pieces, but it also allows white to open the a-file with tempo. This move ing5 strategically exploits the weakened light squares around black's king, creating immediate tactical threats and forcing black to react defensively rather than continuing their counterplay. Black is consolidating after the pawn sacrifice and recapturing material, aiming to activate the rook on the e-file to challenge white's control and potentially exploit the weakened kingside. This is a powerful discovered check that forces black to disrupt their pawn structure further and opens the g-file for a devastating attack. The king boldly steps forward to a more active square, aiming to escape the discovered check threat from the knight and centralize itself for potential defensive and offensive operations. The move Rab1 prepares to exploit the vulnerable a-pawn and potentially activate the rook on the b-file, applying pressure to black's queenside pawn structure. The move 26, b5 is a crucial repositioning, withdrawing the bishop from the attacked diagonal and preparing to contest the key e5 square, potentially preventing white from establishing a decisive central outpost with their knight. This move aims to force an exchange of queens, simplifying the position and potentially creating a favorable endgame due to white's better pawn structure and active pieces. This move aims to centralize the rook, contesting the c-file and preparing to put pressure on white's queenside pawns or potentially challenge the light-squared bishop's control of the long diagonal. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure and pressure black's d5 pawn while maintaining central influence. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control the long dark squared diagonal and potentially support a kingside attack while unblocking the b-file for the rook. This move intends to create space and a potential outpost for the knight on f4 while also safeguarding the king from any immediate pawn threats on the kingside. The move 29, qd6 repositions the queen to a more active square, connecting the rooks and preparing to potentially challenge white's queenside expansion or support counterplay in the center. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to challenge black's control of the d6 square and potentially support a kingside attack or solidify central control. The rook's redeployment to the e-file aims to contest the open file and potentially support a kingside pawn advance, while also preparing to defend against white's persistent pressure on the central squares. This move activates the rook on the e-file, aiming to exploit the open file and the weakened kingside pawn structure created by black's pawn push on move 13. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially eyeing the weak pawns on the queenside and supporting a future pawn advance or piece regrouping. This exchange of rooks simplifies the position, relieving pressure on white's e-file and creating an outpost for the knight on e4, while also forcing black's king to expose itself further. The black king is forced onto a more active square, which, while potentially dangerous, now allows it to participate in defending its remaining pawns and potentially flee towards the kingside. This move exploits black's exposed king and the pressure on the b-file by capturing the pawn, initiating a decisive material advantage and opening lines towards the enemy monarch. This capture removes white's strong attacking bishop and simplifies the position, but it also allows white to open the b-file with tempo and potentially attack black's weakened king. This move forces the black king into a critical position, exploiting the open file and the exposed nature of the king after the recent exchanges. The move 34, b5 by black, after white's 34, re1 plus is a desperate attempt to block the check with the bishop, sacrificing its mobility and centralizing it to an awkward square. but it's the only legal move to avoid immediate checkmate. This move initiates a decisive tactical sequence, leveraging the open d-file to force the black king into a vulnerable position and create an unstoppable passed pawn. The king must navigate a minefield of tactical threats, and while this move reactivates the king's defense on the e-file, it's crucial to be aware of the ongoing king hunt and potential for further exchanges. This check forces the black king into a more exposed position, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure and potentially create further tactical opportunities. The king's sudden foray into the center, while seeming dangerous, is a necessary attempt to activate against black's persistent pressure on the queenside and secure a safer square before white's doubled pawns can become a decisive advantage. This move forces the black king to a more exposed square, continuing white's aggressive kingside pressure and aiming to exploit the vulnerable black monarch. The king, having escaped perpetual check, now attempts to find refuge on the kingside, but the open nature of the position and white's queenside pressure make this a precarious retreat. This check forces the black king into a more exposed position, aiming to exploit the open diagonals and files created by the pawn structure and white's active pieces to regain material or deliver checkmate. The black king boldly advances into enemy territory, seeking an active role and potential counterplay against white's centralized pieces. This move forces the black king back into a more confined central position, aiming to exploit the king's vulnerability and potentially set up mating threats or further exchanges that favor white. This move brings the black king back into a more centralized position, which can be useful in king and pawn endgames to support pawn advances or attack opposing pawns. But it also risks exposing itself to further checks from white's queen. This move forces black's king to an even more exposed central position, allowing white to consolidate their material advantage and continue the attack. After a relentless series of forcing checks and exchanges, black is finally forced to bring the king into the action to avoid further material loss. But this king is now exposed and vulnerable to white's remaining attacking pieces. This move capitalizes on black's exposed king, forcing a decisive king hunt through a series of checks that will lead to material gain or checkmate. White's discovered check forces the black king to a dangerous central square, setting up further complications and potential mating threats. This rook sacrifice forces the black king into a very exposed position, aiming to win material or checkmate by exploiting the open files and the king's lack of defenders. After the exchange, the king is exposed in the center after capturing the rook, and white's queen and rook are poised to exploit the open files and the king's lack of shelter, leading to a decisive material advantage. This move is a simple pawn capture that wins material, as the pawn on a6 is undefended and the black king is forced to move away from any immediate checks, resulting in a decisive material advantage for white.